How stealth technology bankrupted the Soviet Union. The blip didn't appear. That was the problem. A black triangle slid across Iraq's night, and the Soviet-built radar net stared into silence. In Moscow, a colonel traced an empty sweep with his finger and realized doctrine didn't cover nothing. Months earlier, a CIA estimate had warned Soviet air defenses would remain vulnerable to stealth for at least a decade. Now, explosions landed with surgical calm while screens showed weather and noise. Increase emissions, came the order. The budget officer in the doorway did the math. Seeing nothing wasn't just embarrassing. It was about to get very, very expensive. Here's the question we're testing to the limit. Did stealth technology bankrupt the Soviet Union in slow motion, forcing it to buy visibility it could never afford? This isn't a gadget story, it's a ledger story. On one side, a handful of heretics at Skunk Works turned a Russian diffraction paper into faceted geometry and an airplane that only a computer could keep honest. Ben Rich took part to Ufimtsev's math, told pilots fly by wire or don't fly, and bet careers on absence as armor. On the other side, PVO generals had built their lives on a ladder: detect, track, engage. When detection failed, that ladder didn't wobble, it vanished. Between them stood ministers and plant directors, forced to choose between breadlines and bandwidth. What we'll show comes from paper, not legend. A 1985 CIA estimate that called the vulnerability early. Squadron histories from Area 51 to Panama to Desert Storm that logged what Soviet-made systems couldn't see. Hoover's files on the USSR's budget tricks, and the moment in 1989 when partial truth became a second bill. Follow the memos and the money. Stealth didn't just hide airplanes, it weaponized accounting. Here's the roadmap. First, the Heresy, how faceting, not fairy dust, took 3/4 off a radar cross-section and demanded a new way to fly. Then, the day radar blinked. Iraqi tapes and empty scopes forced Moscow to read unacceptable detection probability into the record. Next, the accidental economic weapon. Counter-stealth meant VHF arrays, multistatic geometries, passive nets, fusion nodes. Ideas elegant on slides and brutal on ledgers. We'll watch real plants chase op-amps, rewrite tolerances, and ship systems that worked in parades and lied in storms. Then comes the reckoning. Budgets in rubles, embargoes that starved chips and machine tools, disclosure that satisfied no one, and programs that rescoped instead of admitting collapse. Finally, the meaning. Stealth as cost imposition doctrine. The trick wasn't invisibility, it was arithmetic. Make the other side pay more to see you than you paid to show up. By the end, you'll see how an empty scope becomes an invoice, how increase emissions turns into overtime outages and IOUs, how a quiet airplane taught planners a louder truth. Detection is conditional, expensive, and never free. Stay with the paper trail. The numbers are colder than any myth, and they tell you why a superpower learned to fear silence. The Heresy at Skunk Works. They didn't start with an airplane. They started with a mistake radar shouldn't forgive. In a windowless room at the ranch, engineers set a metal wedge under a spotlight and watched the return collapse. The paper that made it possible wasn't secret and wasn't American. Piotr Ufimtsev had written in dense math that energy slides along edges and leaks from corners. If you could predict the leaks, you could starve the receiver. To most, it was elegant theory. To Denai's Overholser, it was a recipe. The price of using it was ugliness. Kelly Johnson's airplanes had been sculptures. U-2, a 12, SR-71, curves tuned to air like music. Ben Rich walked in with a mock-up that looked carved by a blunt chisel. Flat facets, sharp chines, no sweep unless a computer swore a radar wouldn't see it. Johnson squinted, then said the line only a leader invested in the future gets to say, prove it. Proving it meant accepting that aerodynamics and electromagnetics wanted different shapes. The faceting that bounced radar away also bounced stability out the window. The model swiveled like it wanted to sit backward. The cure lived in code. Fly by wire or don't fly, Rich told test pilots, and they believed him because the airframe didn't. Control laws hijacked physics millisecond by millisecond, lying to surfaces until the airplane believed it was stable long enough to be useful. The first air breathed at Area 51. Have Blue arrived at night, rolled under sodium lamps that looked like secrecy turned into weather, and taxied past hangars that had seen stranger. Orders banned the word stealth from unclassified memos. Crews called it shape, signature, or simply the thing. Radar range days felt like seances for engineers. Stand back, hold your coffee, don't breathe while the scope sweeps. Numbers came back indecently small. Against some sets, the return went under the noise floor. The room stayed silent because careers had been wagered on the possibility that nothing could be measured. Nothing isn't an instrument, flight rules. Hiding from radar meant hiding from friends. No handy TACAN beacon, no radar altimeter singing you through a dust layer. Everything that said safe to pilots lit up radar like a Christmas tree. So planning became ritual. Planners threaded routes through known emitters, turned the jet so facets never offered a broadside, and rehearsed until a 1-degree yaw felt like a crime. Soviet radars trucked to the desert got nicknames, Mary, Kathy, because it's easier to kill a signal when you can talk to it. The airplane didn't so much fly as present. It wasn't invincible. Heat bubbled the skin. Coatings demanded the kind of patience maintainers rarely have in hangars that smell like solvents and bad coffee. Knife edges had to be knife edges. A sloppy seam grew a signature you could see from space. Pilots learned to trust a black box that never blinked. Engineers learned that every convenience was a betrayer, and leaders learned that secrecy makes every mishap look like a program obituary. One prototype crashed, then another. Each time, you could feel the program inhale through its teeth. DARPA cheered because DARPA loves bets that offend physics. The Air Force hedged. The question wasn't only does it work, it was can we task it? How do you schedule something the tower can't see? How do you train crews to land on a dry lake bed at night because lights are loud? The answers arrived in checklists written in pencil and rewritten after every sortie. Then proof. Before the world learned the name F-117, the jet took a quiet walk over Panama. The screens that mattered showed weather. The targets that mattered stopped mattering. Back at Groom Lake, a few people allowed themselves a smile and then went back to measuring seams with a machinist's kiss. What the heretics had built wasn't magic. Shaping did most of the work. 3/4 of the radar cross-section reduction came from geometry. Coatings and ferrites were margin, not miracle. The rest lived in discipline. Shape, software, maintenance, mission planning. Every corner cut grew a blip. Every lazy rivet bought a radar operator a promotion. You didn't own invisibility. You rented it by the minute and paid in procedures. Meanwhile, the other religion, power plus coverage equals certainty, was waiting across an ocean, confident that energy and netting could force anything to declare itself. The Heresy answered with absence, and absence traveled well. In binder clips and test cards, in the way crews learned to treat a radar screen like an opponent instead of a mirror, the Heresy became a doctrine. Build more, train in silence, never offer a broadside, pretend you're not there even when you are. The Skunk works handed the Air Force a problem no syllabus covered. How do you integrate a whole? How do you write tactics around a platform whose first job is to erase itself? They didn't know yet that the first people to really understand the answer wouldn't be pilots or planners. They would be accountants, looking at a scope that showed weather and hearing a colonel say, increase emissions, and realizing in the pause before the next sweep that nothing had just been priced. The day radar blinked. Stakes were simple and brutal. Soviet air defense lived by a ladder: detect, track, engage. Detection wasn't a prelude, it was the doctrine. Then something new slid through the mesh and looked like weather. The first hints didn't arrive as alarms. They showed up as anomalies buried in training tapes from exports the USSR had scattered across allies, Baghdad among them. Technicians flagged ripples that rose and fell like noise, oddly timed to power dips and jamming that didn't match any catalogue. Analysts pulled the reels, ran them frame by frame, and saw nothing they could brief without risking a career. The scope showed clutter. The target map showed craters. What a small circle in Washington already had on paper. A 1985 CIA estimate warning Soviet air defenses would remain vulnerable to stealth aerodynamic systems for at least a decade. The physics pointed to absence. Facets and angles pushed energy away so efficiently that the few photons stumbling back hugged the noise floor. The radars weren't failing. Doctrine was. In vans wired by Soviet diagrams, crews did what training taught: ride the gain up when anxious. Increase emissions, get clarity. But power only helps if a wave hits square. Against a shape that refused broadside, more energy just lit up everything else. Hills, weather, ground returns, until the scope looked like snow with no confession tucked inside it. Operators chased ghosts across screens that hissed. In Moscow, the first shock wasn't a headline. It was a memo after Panama written in tidy, hedged prose. 2 targets engaged without prior classification. No early warning track recorded. Possible low observable threat. Possible equipment malfunction. Recommend review of frequency diversity and multistatic trials. Between the lines, we didn't see it coming, and we don't know why. Senior officers argued the comfortable alternatives. Better jamming, lower altitude, bad luck. That fit the ladder. Jamming you can counter. Altitude you can measure. Then the tapes from Desert Storm arrived. The Iraqi IADS, assembled from Soviet catalogs, SAR-2s, SAR-3s, SAR-6s, voice-netted control, sector radars layered like roofing tile, should have chewed on anything that showed. Instead, it folded. Not instantly, but fast enough that radar-guided SAMs faded into statistical background after the opening days. AAA stitched the sky where doctrine said targets would appear. The black jets didn't run that play. A colonel who'd spent 2 decades coloring range rings traced an empty sweep with his finger and knew what no one wanted in minutes. The first rung was missing. Without reliable detection, the rest wasn't a sequence, it was a hope. His deputy glanced at procurement timelines and felt something colder. If stealth was real, and battle footage treated it as real, the fix wasn't a gadget, it was an architecture. The shopping list sounded simple in a sentence and savage in a ledger. Go long in wavelength, VHF-UHF arrays to blunt shaping. Go wide in geometry, multistatic constellations to triangulate whispers. Go tall, over the horizon fences to see beyond curvature and cue other sets. Add passive receivers to harvest emissions an airplane tried not to shed. Each idea carried merit. Together, they mapped onto a country's entire grid. One detail sharpened the problem. Stealth's edge wasn't a fuselage alone. Mission planning software in the US built routes that presented the worst possible angles to known emitters. Survivability lived in code and habit, treating radars like a chess opponent, never offering a broadside, never giving a timing pattern away for free. The PVO had to answer more than metal. It had to answer method. Engineers in Soviet labs, with Ufimtsev on their shelves too, argued counter-stealth was solvable, with enough sensors, enough integration, enough time. They were right in principle, but integration wasn't a slide. It was factories, clocks, train crews, and power budgets that didn't blink when the weather did. And a national ledger already pretending defense was smaller than it was. When Moscow finally published a larger number in 1989, the outside world was confused and the inside wasn't impressed. The figure looked big. It wasn't big enough for everything on the list. A micro story from a field unit captured the bind. A sector crew went to frequency agility to sniff below clutter. The scope teased a thin rise. The commander radioed possible bearing 317. By the time the angle resolved, the angle was behind them. In the log, someone wrote noise coincident. In the margins, someone else wrote again. So doctrine blinked. Briefings traded range rings for probability clouds. A slide appeared with 4 words that no one argued: unacceptable detection probability. The man reading it didn't dramatize. He priced fixes, multiband arrays, network time, fusion centers. The numbers didn't debate, they marched. On paper, the answer was straightforward. Buy enough sensors to make absence hurt less. In practice, it meant building a nation-sized listening machine faster than an opponent could change its rhythm. For the first time, generals trained to flood a sky with power heard the quiet truth inside the tapes. Detection is conditional, certainty is rented, and silence, priced over a decade, can break you. The accidental, economic weapon. Stakes shifted the minute. Nothing on scope turned into, we need everything at once. Counter-stealth wasn't a tweak, it was a posture. and posture costs. In Moscow, the fix that sounded tidy in a briefing, see lower, wider, farther, unfurled into procurement plans that touched every ministry with a soldering iron. VHF and UHF arrays to blunt shaping, multistatic constellations to triangulate whispers, over the horizon fences to cue sectors beyond curvature. Passive receivers to harvest emissions an airplane tried not to shed. Each layer reduced doubt. Each layer carried a bill. The action began as feasibility papers disguised as physics. Extend Nebo-class lines with digital back ends. Pair tired P-18 to new processors. Build synchronized time bases so sites kilometers apart could measure single-digit microseconds. None of that lived on a whiteboard. It lived in factories already late on radios, in microelectronics throttled by COCOM lists, in depots where spares moved on paper the way diesel moved by rumor. A colonel could demand a network. A plant director had to conjure clocks. Component reality bit fast. Low-frequency radars compensate for shaping, but they demand acreage, mast steel and megawatts. Over-the-horizon fences need quiet bands and miles of wire. Multistatic requires clean oscillators, exact links, and fusion that doesn't crash when rain arrives sideways. Every clever idea spawned 3 new requirements. Every requirement spawned delay. The impact landed first at the plant gate. Directors were told to accelerate, while procurement officers came back from Moscow with thin envelopes. Copper quotas tightened. West German machine tools on order vanished to embargo. Substitute op amps changed noise floors, forcing new calibration cycles, forcing retests, forcing memos stamped temporary deviation. Morale sagged from pride to dark humor. A fitter held up a carton of imported chips and said, "This is what our doctrine looks like now." In kitchens, the shift felt blunter. Budgets that never admitted their full size now carried a line called counter-stealth priority. Bread deferred to bandwidth. Wives stood in longer lines while husbands did longer shifts. Managers learned triage, defer maintenance, cannibalize prototypes for parade units, borrow crews. "We'll catch up" slid down the calendar until it fell off. A micro-story made it plain. A regional plant near Gorky won a contract to build low-band receiver front ends. The spec assumed Czechoslovak op-amps. The shipment stalled. Engineering slotted a Soviet part with higher flicker noise. That forced a gain change in the analog path, which saturated in storms, which forced software filters, which needed a faster CPU, which the line couldn't build. The unit shipped within revised tolerance after the tolerance moved. The radar worked for demonstrations. It lied in weather. Training created its own invoice. For every array fielded, 3 crews needed certification. For every class, a university needed oscilloscopes and instructors who hadn't emigrated. Time bases had to agree across districts. Links had to stay up through winter. Doctrine had to reteach officers to fuse partials into decisions. Each lesson cost hours nobody had and rubles nobody counted out loud. Feedback made it worse. Early deployments produced mixed results. Better queuing here, a track rescued there. Those partial wins justified the next tranche, but dispersion exposed logistics. Concentrating excellence had been the old trick, one showpiece battery beside a museum. Stealth forced competence everywhere, and competence doesn't copy like blueprints. A Nebo M accepted into service went to a brigade whose depot lacked spares, whose trucks drank fuel the quartermaster didn't have, whose operators rotated before they mastered the menu. The array stood straight, the vans hummed, the scope looked beautiful. The duty officer admitted they didn't leave it up in wind. Across town, the accountants wrote a sentence that never went to press. Counter-stealth cost growth is unsustainable. Inside ministries, someone underlined unsustainable and added, reallocate from non-critical sectors. Non-critical meant agriculture, transit, clinics. A deputy asked why the new fence dimmed neighborhoods 2 towns over. He was told to be proud. Pride didn't boil water. Another micro scene. A depot chief uncrated a timing module and found a missing oven-controlled crystal oscillator. The packing slip read, install when available. He called a friend who knew a man across a border who knew a price. The part arrived in a plain box labeled kitchen. Under load, It sang slightly off-key. They made it work and guessed which storms would make it lie. Meanwhile, the threat didn't pause for parity. F-117 in Desert Storm opened with radars and command posts, the eyes and nerves meant to see them first. Tapes that crossed desks in Moscow argued cost more clearly than any editorial. If you can't see the opener, you don't get a second act. Requisitions shifted from urgent to existential. Existential requisitions make bad economists. The ministries approved everything in principle and funded nothing in full. On paper, coverage maps went green. In practice, gaps hardened in strange places, between stations that didn't share clocks, between crews that didn't share doctrine, between promises and power sockets. Units learned a new drill: acknowledge a ghost track, vector a fighter into empty air, right, no further activity observed. By now, the weapon wasn't the airplane. It was the invoice it wrote for anyone who tried to erase it. Low observables had turned absence into a billable offense. The USSR, already balancing oil, grain, and a fiction about defense share, started paying interest on invisibility, compounding in masked steel, op-amps, diesel, and missed dinners. Detection had always been expensive. Stealth made the price arrive on time. Black jets in the desert. Stakes moved from test ranges to targets when absence met orders. If the F-117's promise was math, its proof came quiet over Panama. December 1989, no fanfare, no announcement. Two black shapes slipped through cloud toward Noriega's defenses. The picture on the scopes looked like weather. The bombs wrote neat handwriting on hangars, barracks, a PDF headquarters. In an after-action note, a line read almost bored, "No early warning track." That sentence traveled farther than the airplanes did. The crews who flew it remembered the silence first. Briefings in windowless rooms, routes shaved to single degrees so a facet never wandered into a broadside. Checklists that banned convenience, no radar altimeter, no friendly beacons, because anything easy was loud. Night vision goggles tuned to a cockpit that barely glowed. A cough in the mask felt like a broadcast. They stepped to jets that looked wrong sitting still, pointed them into darkness, and trusted a black box to lie to the wings until the wings believed. Back in vans built to Soviet diagrams, operators wrestled with gear that wasn't broken so much as speaking the wrong language. VHF could hint, and over-the-horizon Q could point, but the kill chain required a track, and the track kept melting into clutter because the returns that mattered were designed to look like everything else. A battery commander got a voice call, possible, and a bearing with a question mark. By the time the angle resolved, the angle was behind him. In January 1991, the thesis scaled. Desert Storm opened before dawn with black jets punctual, not fast, threading Iraqi airspace along routes the mission planners' model liked. The first targets weren't glamorous. They were eyes and nerves, radars, command bunkers, communications nodes, picked from catalogs that looked familiar in Moscow. On the tapes that crossed desks a week later, radar-guided SAMs mattered early, then faded into statistics. AAA stitched air where doctrine said targets would appear. The black jets didn't run that play. Cockpit video told the story in plain geometry. A crosshair paused, slid, paused again. Laser spots pinned aimpoints beneath the noise floor. Bombs walked down rooflines like a teacher's neat strokes. Infrared caught blast waves rippling courtyards in black and white. Post-strike imagery showed holes where doors had been. Nothing miraculous, just mission plans meeting physics under a moon that didn't care. It was the kind of proof a PVO staff couldn't file under rumor. A micro story landed hardest. A hardened command bunker, confident in concrete and habit, took a direct hit through its air shaft, a throat no one thought a bomb could swallow. The tape sat on a Moscow desk, surrounded by ashtrays and men who didn't smoke inside until that week. They didn't argue about jamming anymore. They argued about cost. Inside the squadrons, the discipline looked like superstition turned professional. Edges wiped with gloved hands until a seam felt like a blade. You're measured in pencil notes because a degree bloomed returns. Maintenance logs scolded sloppy rivets as if they were treason. If invisibility was rented, this was the rent, procedures that priced minutes in attention. In Iraqi vans, the human moments turned technical frustration into fatigue. A crew switched bands and found snow. Gain up, and the scope bloomed into uselessness. A sector commander tried to raise batteries whose cable trunks lay in smoking trenches. A technician in a corner practiced the new drill. Acknowledge a ghost, vector a fighter, log, no further activity observed. The doctrine that lived by a ladder felt its first rung gone. The bureaucratic shockwave followed fast. Post-war assessments in Moscow closed loopholes denial had sheltered. Unacceptable detection probability appeared in memos that knew what it was admitting. Orders arrived with urgency that made bad economics worse. Accelerate VHF fields, expand Nebo deployments, trial multistatic nets, fund passive receivers. Everything the slides had promised in principle now carried procurement numbers. Back where the jets lived, tempo cooled. Hangars shut their doors. The black jets returned to rumor with tail numbers, but the tapes didn't go quiet. Planners watched them like coaches study film. Technicians fed them back into models. Lessons turned into muscle. The routes, the timings, the way a radar face flinches before it speaks. A micro scene from a debrief stuck with a crew chief years later. A young pilot pointed at a still frame, a concrete square with a circle inside, and said, "Air shaft." He traced the path his bomb would take in a building he'd never enter. No swagger, just confidence in a map made from absence. He closed the binder, sipped cold coffee, and wrote a note the tape didn't need. Do not yaw. Across the ocean, generals who'd spent careers measuring range rings by catalogue began measuring by silence. The map they trusted didn't know how to price a hole, but the ledger did. A quiet airplane had taught a louder truth. If the opener can't be seen, the rest of your doctrine is algebra with a missing term. And every minute you spend trying to find that term carries a cost you can't hide in the margins. The counter-stealth arms race no one could afford. Stakes hardened into a single sentence nobody wrote down. To see one airplane, the Soviet Union had to rebuild the way it saw everything. The S-300 belts on paper looked like strength, smarter missiles, better seekers, wider envelopes. But stealth had moved the first question from can you shoot to can you see, so procurement sprouted branches. Pair batteries with Nebo VHF UHF, arrays to catch edges shaping tried to starve. Trial by static and multi-static geometries, transmitters and receivers stretched across kilometers to triangulate whispers below noise. Add passive nets, Kolchuga-style ears listening for echoes off city radio, and TV, airport radars, anything loud enough to betray a hole where an airplane should have been. Each layer promised confidence. Each layer wrote a bill. Field tests arrived like relief. A Nebo SVU crew parked on a ridge and reported detections conventional sets missed. A multi-static trial teased a track from clutter under controlled conditions. A passive array stitched transients into a line that matched a known flight with seconds to spare. Slides filled with green dots, acronyms, and the most dangerous word in any staff brief, scalable. Then scale arrived, and the physics of economics took over. 5 prototypes rode on hand, picked parts, borrowed clocks, and engineers sleeping on site. Turning 5 into 50 required silicon the domestic base struggled to produce, and an integration discipline no decree could conjure. The bottlenecks read like a plan the market had vetoed. Nebo's digital back-ends wanted high reliability op-amps and clean time bases. COCOM lists made those parts scarce or expensive. Substitutions added hiss that forced software compensations that demanded faster processors that factories couldn't build at volume. A single missed spec cascaded until acceptance tests carried the phrase, within revised tolerance. Systems worked in parades. They lied in storms. Human angles sharpened the irony. Engineers knew exactly what to buy, better ACs, tighter oscillators, disciplined sync across sites, and could sketch the bill of materials from memory. Plant directors knew the reality, older machine tools, fewer shifts, procurement officers paying in IOUs. Staff colleges updated syllabi to teach counter-stealth tactics. Regimental commanders updated rosters to reflect conscripts trained on vacuum sets now staring at digital scopes they didn't trust. Everyone repeated modernization like a prayer and counted screws like agnostics. Meanwhile, Western investments doubled down on the thing Moscow was paying to erase. The F-117's mission planner improved its chess. The B-2 matured. The idea wasn't to outrun defenses. It was to keep changing presentation angles the model liked. So every Soviet fix arrived into a moving problem. A Nebo field might catch an edge at one aspect. The next generation route shaved a degree and fell back into noise. The net learned. The fish changed shape. A deputy premier asked a question that sounded pedantic and wasn't. How many megawatts does an over-the-horizon fence drink in winter? The answer dimmed neighborhoods. Someone's city would go dark, so a queue might nudge a sector that might find a dot that might be a flock. Planners colored maps green. Power managers colored outage schedules red. Pride handled the discrepancy. Pride didn't boil water. Prototype success didn't scale because logistics didn't bend. A Nebo M accepted into service arrived at a brigade whose depot had no spares, whose trucks drank diesel the quartermaster didn't have, whose operators rotated before mastering menus. On inspection day, the array stood straight, the vans hummed, the scope looked beautiful. The duty officer admitted they didn't leave it up in wind. A passive network strung along a frontier celebrated an intriguing track that turned out to be a TV relay bouncing off a hill. Confidence dies in small corrections. A micro-story from a regional hub captured the treadmill. The fusion center merged two partials into one solid track. Cheering in the van sounded like old pride. Then the lights flickered. The local grid couldn't carry the system and the city together. The track died. A lieutenant logged the moment and wrote 2 words a historian would circle later. Almost works. Leadership couldn't retreat without confessing theology was wrong. So they ordered everything at once. S-300 PM upgrades, beside extended Nebo fields, beside multi-static trials, beside papers on L-band noses for fighters, beside proposals for photonic front ends nobody could fabricate. Each choice made sense alone. Together, they made a trap. A national commitment to seeing better that required a national economy capable of building better for years, coherently. From the engineer's perspective, the patches would have sown a net, given 10 quiet years and steady supply. The quiet years never came. Oil slid. Chips didn't appear. Ministries didn't share clocks. The arms race no one could afford wasn't a sprint. It was a treadmill set 1 notch faster than the country's lungs. Across an ocean, crews rolled black jets into hangars, wiped knife edges with gloved hands, and waited to ask the same expensive question again. Budgets, rubles, and the vanishing future. Stakes stopped being slides and started being salaries the moment arithmetic met winter. By the late 198s, the ledgers the public never saw were already whispering what crews in the field felt. Defense's real share, long disguised, was swelling while revenue thinned. Oil had slid from mid-decade highs. Hard currency dried into a trickle. The counter-stealth shopping list, neat in a binder, now meant rubles that bought less each month. Action began with a simple contradiction. The same year ministries stamped accelerate on VHF fields, multistatic trials, passive nets, and fusion nodes. COCOM lists choked microelectronics and precision machine tools. Plant managers opened crates labeled for timing modules and found gaps where oven-controlled oscillators should have been. A memo came back from procurement with 2 words, not available, and a third that carried the smell of defeat, substitute. Substitutions hissed where specifications said whisper, pushed gain stages towards saturation, and turned carefully modeled filters into frantic software patches. Cannibalization became policy in everything but name. Strip a prototype to finish a parade unit. Strip a parade unit to meet an inspection. Impact moved through people before it hit doctrine. A factory director in Minsk wrote, output maintained. And everyone knew it meant nights on borrowed oscilloscopes, inspectors stamping papers to keep wages moving, and test bays swapping cables because there weren't enough connectors to go around. Shadow procurement returned with boxes routed through third countries at prices that made accountants flinch and engineers suspicious. Parts arrived late with provenance as murky as their noise figures. They powered up on acceptance day and sulked in weather. A colonel in logistics spent a week scrounging fuel vouchers to move 1 Nebo mast and missed his daughter's school play. In the mess hall, Jokes about ghost catchers gave way to a quieter anger about empty shelves. Parallel to the spend, disclosure landed like a second bill. In 1989, when Moscow finally published a larger defense figure, it surprised no one inside and confused everyone outside. The number looked big. It wasn't big enough. The Hoover files would later show the wrestling, publish a truer sum and risk credibility, or keep the old lie and risk a treaty. They split the difference, and the ledger refused to split with them. Once released, the figure became a flaw for expectation. Commanders heard larger budget and wrote requisitions to match. Ministers heard larger budget and cut elsewhere to keep the fiction intact. A deputy finance minister ran a finger down a column and found bottom. Oil receipts had faltered, debt service hadn't. "We can't afford to see," he told a room that didn't take minutes. Across town, a marshal told a different room what he had to. "We can't afford not to." Both were right. That's how systems crack. Plant floors turned into classrooms for cynicism. Crews learned to make do with amplifiers that hissed and time bases that drifted on cold mornings. Training officers learned to pass conscripts through courses written for technicians the system could no longer produce. A Nebo battery declared operational with 2 crews, one brilliant, one learning, because paper doesn't care about muscle memory. A passive net went up without proper sync because clocks were on backorder. Everyone nodded, promised to fix it next tranche, and watched tranches arrive like weather, forecast, delayed, thin. Paperwork invented victory. Coverage maps colored green before circuits closed. Readiness reports hit targets with asterisks. IOC achieved, sat beside, pending final integration. General officers cut ribbons in fields that would be mud by spring. Television cameras saw antennas, auditors saw debt. In one oblast, a new over-the-horizon fence drank megawatts and dimmed neighborhoods 2 towns over. A deputy asked about compensation. He was told to be proud. Pride didn't boil water. Meanwhile, the other side kept stacking cost imposers. Precision weapons shaved aim points into minutes and meters. Decoys drank radar time and forced emissions no schedule loved. Jammers learned new manners each season. Each edition forced another Soviet line item. Add ECCM modules, add software updates, add training hours you didn't budget, until the list read like a riddle with one answer: spend forever. In academies, instructors rewrote lectures and swallowed the subtext. Radar theory modules grew sections on edge diffraction and presentation management that drew a quiet line back to Ufimtsev's math. Fighter tactics blocks taught pilots to think of radar like a living opponent. SAM officers practiced engagements under partial tracks, managing uncertainty instead of pretending it didn't exist. Adaptation without resources became performance art. A micro scene caught the tone. A depot crew uncrated a timing rack, found the critical oscillator missing, and a note taped inside: "Install when available." The chief called a man who knew a man across a border. A plain box labeled electrical component, kitchen, arrived by train. Under load, the oscillator sang only slightly off-key. They made it work and guessed which storms would make it lie. By winter, a phrase that had begun in memos had migrated to mouths: unsustainable. It sat beside national priority in the same meeting, and the math didn't blink. The USSR had excelled at concentrating excellence. One showcase battery rubbing shoulders with a museum. Stealth forced dispersion, competence everywhere at scale for years. Under oil slump, export controls, and shrinking rubles, the competence started vanishing. And with it, the future they kept promising on paper. The moment of realization. Admitting the truth meant rewriting a religion. Curtains closed against a grey Moscow morning. A civilian with wire-rim glasses stood in front of generals who had grown up on range rings and certainties. He didn't dramatize. He cued a strike tape. Freeze frame, an empty scope. Next frame, detonation. He moved to radar logs, timestamps, frequencies, gain settings, then to a timeline where a target existed only after impact. He clicked to a slide with 4 words that had no argument left in them. Unacceptable detection probability. He didn't sell fear, he priced it. Multiband arrays to blunt shaping, synchronized clocks measured in microseconds, fusion centers to knit probability into something a commander could act on. The numbers didn't debate. They marched down the screen in rubles and years. A general cleared his throat to ask about jamming. The civilian nodded, flipped back to the tape, and let the emptiness answer. Staff notes shifted their weight. Phrases that once measured pride, intercept regiment readiness, response time to sector alert, lost meaning without reliable cueing. Speed was theater if you couldn't see the play. Sam Belt's inked bold on maps became cartography of hope. Early warning grids that had rung like bells for decades had to be retuned to hear whispers. A colonel responsible for manuals wrote a memo that didn't bury the lead. The ladder is misaligned for low observable conditions. Training sequence must begin with cue management, not intercept geometry. He signed it with a steady hand that had believed the ladder his whole life. The human hinge arrived as 2 pages, no flourish. It opened with based on validated foreign operations and closed with resource allocation must precede doctrine. Between those lines lived a confession. Counter-stealth wasn't a tactic you could bolt on. It was a system you had to build, feed, and maintain. The signature wasn't a dissident. It belonged to a career officer with clean boots and a bookshelf full of doctrine he had helped write. Across an ocean, the timing mocked them. B-2s rolled from hangars that looked like geography. The ATF competition that would name the F-22 wasn't secret to anyone who read budgets. Tomahawks wrote their own arithmetic across maps, saturating defenses with precision the size of decisions. JSDARS circled and drew moving pictures over battlefield's Soviet ground stations, recognized and envied. The message wasn't even subtext. Stealth would open, precision would follow, networks would arbitrate. Inside planning cells, the choice they'd hoped to stage was forced. Feed the military machine or feed the nation. They tried both. Paper increased defense transparency even as hard currency shrank. Commanders were told to modernize. Plant managers were told to economize. Engineers proposed phased rollouts. Politicians heard immediate effect. The state tried to rebuild its senses while the floorboards softened beneath it. In classrooms, the rewrite got personal. Radar theory modules gained sections on edge diffraction and presentation management that drew a quiet line back to Ufimtsev's math. Fighter tactics blocks taught pilots to treat radar like a living opponent, never offer a broadside, never be predictable. SAM officers practiced engagements under partial tracks, learning to value cue management over the old comfort of perfect range rings. The doctrine didn't collapse, it bent. But adaptation without resources was performance art. A deadline appeared on a wall: deploy initial VHF fields by quarter, stand up a fusion cell by year's end, certify multistatic trials by spring. The first 2 landed on time the way deadlines land in rigid systems, ceremonially. The third slipped into the kind of delay that infects calendars, indefinite. Operators did what they always do. They made do. A chief engineer taught a night class because his department had lost 3 men to emigration. A conscript learned to clean contacts with vodka because the official solvent was reallocated. A regimental chief of staff advised his brother's son to study anything but electronics because the radios lied more than the papers. A micro scene settled like frost. A marshal alone at a desk signed a procurement order and knew it was a hope certificate. He'd watched the tapes, swallowed the pride, listened to the accountants. He didn't believe in ghosts. He believed in tracks. But the only way to get tracks was to buy a horizon's worth of machines and minutes, and the state he served was pricing bread. He capped his pen. Outside, a truck coughed in the cold. Inside, the ladder leaned against a wall it no longer reached. Another room, same morning. A younger officer slid a single-line brief across to his general. Detection is conditional. It wasn't a plea. It was a new first sentence. The general stared, then wrote 2 words that would echo through syllabi and budgets for a decade. Price accordingly. The price of chasing ghosts. Stakes turned from theory to total burden the moment invoices met a collapsing economy. Counter-stealth wasn't a line item anymore. It was an appetite. Every new array, every fusion node, every passive net added weight to a budget already hiding its size. Leadership called it modernization. Crews on factory floors called it chasing ghosts. Programs didn't die, they rescoped. A regional over-the-horizon fence lost 2 sectors and kept the ribbon cutting. A passive network declared initial operating capability with half its sites pending synchronization. Batteries meant to pair S-300 PM launchers with fresh Nebo sets deployed on paper while the vans sat behind chain link because fuel vouchers hadn't cleared. On maps, coverage expanded. On scopes, gaps hardened. Project rooms became triage centers. Engineers stacked compromises like sandbags, substitute op amps that hissed, accept higher ADC noise, crank software filters to compensate, buy grey market processors to keep the loop from falling apart. Each workaround introduced jitter the model didn't love. Trainers adjusted syllabi to reality. Students learned to live with revised tolerance, while instructors hid their anger in jokes about hearing snow. The air defense map stopped looking like a belt and started looking like an archipelago. Brigades with partial capability guarded sectors that were mostly sky. Between proud dots, coverage sagged across valleys known only to scheduling clerks and the officers who lived with them. A duty officer in the west practiced a drill his supervisor called the shrug acknowledge a ghost track, vector a fighter to nowhere, log, no further activity observed. A depot chief uncrated a Nebo module and found a missing oscillator wrapped in a note. Install when available. He stared, then called a man who knew a man across a border who knew a price. The part arrived in a plain box labeled electrical component, kitchen. Under load, it sang slightly off-key. They made it work and guessed which storms would make it lie. Visible failures cut through the ranks faster than any official history. A radar that went blind in rain. A multistatic node drifting out of sync after a freeze. But each failure drove spending. A report stamped urgent justified a retrofit. A retrofit justified a new tranche. A new tranche deepened deficits. In meetings, unsustainable sat beside national priority, and both sides nodded like that made sense. Economic strain seeped into things that make living survivable. Consumer factories missed output because defense lots took the clean wafers. Farm machines shipped with controllers that browned out in frost because the good capacitors lived in olive vans. Buses ran late because diesel diverted to move masts. In kitchens, the price of sausage translated strategy. Bread deferred to bandwidth. Managers oscillated between pep talk and edict. 1 week, slogans, modernization, parity, vigilance. The next, numbers, reduce outages, raise readiness, accelerate trials. A colonel wrote a memo no one wanted to quote. Integration at scale is not an event. His phone stopped ringing. Orders slowed into suggestions as the center loosened. Parades thinned. Caucuses emptied. Meetings ended without toasts. Programs slipped into amber. The fight to see an enemy that refused to reflect became a fight to get paid. Units that once competed for honor now competed for diesel. Engineers who could have fixed things left. Those who stayed learned to solder longer. The plan to knit the archipelago appeared as a drawing, regional fusion hubs feeding a national picture. Arrows, rings, boxes. It needed clocks aligned across provinces, links that stayed up, crews who didn't rotate before proficiency arrived. The first hub flickered alive and merged 2 partials into one solid track. The second lit with a warning. The third never left its crate. A deputy minister wrote, "Further study," and went home early. Meanwhile, the adversary kept asking the same expensive question. "Can you see me now?" Each ask came with a twist, cleaner mission planning, decoys that pulled aimpoints, jammers smarter than last year. Every twist forced another layer, filters, training, patches. It wasn't courage, it was arithmetic. The more you tried to see, the more you owed to the act of trying. A multistatic net finally caught a whisper on a grey afternoon, 3 sites, 1 confidence blob sliding across a valley. Cheering in the van sounded like old pride. Then the power flickered. The local grid couldn't carry both the system and the city. The track died. A lieutenant wrote 2 words in the margin a historian would circle later, almost works. Plant floors reinvented themselves as catalogues. A Nebo variant appeared in brochures painted desert tan, its numbers rounded and proud. Passive nets acquired new names and consultants with neckties. Export survival demanded confidence, so the spec sheets promised counter-stealth potential like the past hadn't happened. The work wasn't a lie. It was a fragment, good engineering searching for a state that could field it. Across the Union, a pattern hardened. Coverage maps colored green before circuits closed. Readiness reports hit targets with asterisks. IOC achieved, sat beside, pending final integration. Television cameras saw antennas. Auditors saw debt. In one oblast, the fence drew megawatts and dimmed neighborhoods 2 towns over. Pride didn't boil water, but it kept the lights off politely. And through it all, the sentence nobody spoke out loud kept writing itself line by line. To see one airplane, they had to rebuild everything. The invoices didn't care about intent. They only cared about time. The trap springs shut. Stakes turned final when the map stopped being a map and started looking like a breakup letter. The center loosened. Republics argued borders and budgets. Procurement orders aged into souvenirs on cork boards. Plants told to build eyes for a country woke up with new flags and unpaid invoices. Programs didn't die with cancellations. They died with shrugs. Action unraveled in small, relentless ways. Salaries missed and crews scattered. A brigade with 2 certified teams became a unit with 1 technician who knew the weird hum a stable time base makes. Subcontractors folded without announcing it, leaving holes in harnesses and schedules. Test ranges went dark on Tuesdays to save diesel. Acceptance trials turned into performances. The vans powered, the scopes glowed, the colonel smiled, and everyone went home to apartments without hot water. A plant director wrote a farewell on scrap. We built what we could, and didn't sign it because no one was collecting signatures anymore. Warehouses filled with orphan modules, timing racks for fusion centers no one would wire, passive receivers boxed for borders that didn't exist, Nebo panels wrapped in plastic that yellowed like old teeth. A bistatic pair separated by a new borderline couldn't legally talk, so their operators waved at each other across a field and counted birds. A fusion node that once promised to knit a picture now gathered dust in a room lit by a single bulb and a calendar that hadn't turned in months. Impact was immediate and generational. Deployments froze in half-finished grammar, radars without fusion, fusion without clocks, clocks without spares. Units borrowed each other's fuel and men, turning competence into a traveling show. The operators who could make a scope sing found work elsewhere. Engineers who knew the noise figures by heart left for countries that paid. Some designed self-and towers. Some went west and sold what they knew to people who'd written the bill. Others stayed and rebadged projects for export, because survival looked like painting Nebo desert tan and calling it counter-stealth ready. A micro-story caught the tone. In a provincial museum that used to be a regimental HQ, a glass case held a control panel with cigarette burns and a scope that still smelled like dust. A placard read, Air Defense, 198's 199. A boy asked if the radar worked. The docent said, sometimes, and in the corner, an old man ran a finger along a panel's seam and nodded when it felt knife-sharp muscle memory meeting a future that never arrived. On paper, everything stayed confident. Regional fusion hubs, national pictures, arrows and rings pointing at better years. In rooms where boilers clanked and radiators sighed, deputies wrote further study and went home early. The national grid dimmed, then doctrine followed. Orders slowed into suggestions. Inspections turned into visits. Words like synchronization and coverage lost their edge and became small talk you made with a colonel on a long drive between empty sites. Across the border, planners learned the lesson in fewer words. Stealth wasn't a miracle, it was a calculator. Make the other side pay more to see you than you paid to show up. Cost imposition turned into bullet points, black jets open, precision multiplies, decoys and jammers price leverage. Every survivable shooter multiplied the defender's workload. Every cheap question forced an expensive answer. Doctrine bent and then set in a new shape. Russians leaned into layered IADS with VHF-UHF, arrays near belts not as trophies but as cues, passive nets listening, because silence can be more informative than shout, mobility as rule. Shoot, move, deny targeting cycles their rhythm. Americans wrote playbooks that treated stealth as the opener, not the whole act. Networks keep timing honest. Tankers stretch geometry. Satellites hold clocks steady. Precision stopped being special. It became baseline. The meaning felt quiet and everywhere. Stealth hadn't won a clean duel. It had made the old game too expensive to play. The Soviet habit, concentrate excellence, stack belts, flood the sky, met an opponent that refused to offer the surfaces you pay to see. The answer existed: more sensors, smarter fusion, better clocks. It just cost more time, more silicon, more logistics than the state could summon before the ledger ran out. A lieutenant logged the last test of a multistatic net that had finally caught a whisper before the power flickered. He wrote 2 words the historian would circle later: almost works. That margin note read like an epitaph for a decade. Clever ideas built on shifting budgets. Good engineering stuffed into boxes without a grid to feed them. A country trying to buy certainty with IOUs. When people later said the Union collapsed under its own weight, they left out the kilogram stealth added, an invisible tax on a doctrine that demanded certainty. The trap had never been a mystery. It was a sequence, an empty scope, an urgent memo, a shopping list disguised as physics, a plant missing chips, a map colored green, a neighborhood that went dim, a program re-scoped into export, a nation that split. And somewhere in a hangar, a crew wiping knife edges with gloved hands, getting ready to ask the same expensive question again tomorrow. Doctrine rewrites and new math. Stakes didn't dissolve with the flag. They hardened into manuals, syllabi, and budgets that learned a new first sentence. Detection is conditional and costly. The rewrite began in quiet rooms, no fanfare, just pencils and whiteboards, where officers admitted that the old ladder only worked when the first rung held. From there, doctrine split like a river and learned to bend. On the American side, action looked like layers, not heroics. Stealth moved from miracle to opener. You used it to punch the hole, then flooded the gap with timing, fuel, and math. AWACS kept clocks honest. JSDARS made the ground legible. Tankers stretched geometry so crews could hold the angles the model liked. Satellites pinned time so routes could be flown like music instead of maps. The B-2 inherited the quiet and added oceans, heavy math delivered from far away. The fighter half learned to be seen only on purpose. The ATF that became the F-22 fused sensors into one voice, chose when to whisper and when to shut up, and treated radar like a living opponent, not a picture. The rest of the arsenal fell in line. JDAM turned weather into a statistic. JASM-ER turned range into a habit. Harm burned out the eyes that insisted on being loud. The playbook stopped measuring courage and started counting minutes. Meanwhile, Russian doctrine didn't pretend the ghost hadn't charged rent. It accepted the bill and tried to spend smarter. Layering came back, not as parade, but as moving parts. S-300 lines refreshed into S-400 belts, fewer better, wrapped around what mattered. VHF and UHF arrays like Nebo moved near those belts, not as trophies but as cues. Passive nets listened in cities where silence meant something. Mobility turned from slogan to rule: shoot, fold, drive, deny targeting cycles their rhythm. Fighters got noses that watched more than one band, and avionics that sorted ghosts from birds long enough to take a shot and leave. The point wasn't perfection. It was survival through motion and refusal to offer a clean presentation. The human angle shifted uniforms and chalk dust. American instructors taught mission commanders to brief risk like currency, every degree of yaw a budget line. They rehearsed routes until presentation angles were muscle memory, and every minute of radio silence felt like income. Russian academies taught crews to fight for clocks, sync across sites, fuse partials into enough certainty to act, then shut up before the jammers learned them. SAM officers practiced restraint, short emissions, quick relocations, accepting incomplete tracks as the cost of living. Pride stopped being loud. It became precise. Impact showed up as arithmetic. On one side, survivable shooters multiplied defender costs. Each quiet jet, each long-range missile, each decoy forced an opponent to buy more sensors, more fusion, more training hours. On the other, resilience through dispersion multiplied attacker time. Radars that moved after 2 volleys, launchers unfolded in new tree lines, passive receivers that lived in a city's radio soup. Certainty wasn't for sale anymore. Odds were. Planners wrote them on kneeboards, beside headings and fuel. Parallel threads tightened the knot. Precision lost its shine and became baseline. Targets were addresses, windows were coordinates, bunkers were timed throats. Command posts learned to be less centralized. Networks learned to survive in pieces. C2 nodes went mobile and impolite to the old idea of a single map on a single wall. The new math rewarded redundancy you could afford and punished monuments you couldn't defend. Even procurement learned the lesson. Cost imposition turned into a design parameter, not a speech. Software spirals replaced block upgrades. Open architectures let one seeker talk to another without lawyers in the loop. The attacker's curve stayed shallow, pay once to enter, then update to stay. The defender's curve grew teeth, clocks, links, crews, power, all of it recurring, all of it rented. A micro story folded it tight. Dawn over a grey steppe. A Russian battery chief rolled his S-400 elements out of a treeline, tied to a Nebo MQ, whispered from a hill, painted a corridor and stayed quiet. Beyond range, a mixed wave came. Real warheads, MALDs that talked like weapons, a jammer that breathed in one narrow band. The chief rode the first pass with passive bearings and a single short emission, took a shot he could defend, then folded and moved before the next geometry arrived. He survived and didn't brag. Hours later, a stealth bomber opened a bay at the minute the model liked and put 2 weapons into a command node that had moved yesterday and still left its antenna on. Both sides wrote lessons nobody outside would read. Meaning lived in humility. Everyone budgeted for the first move and the second. Everyone put price tags on minutes. The game stopped pretending it could own the sky forever. It started buying enough sky long enough at a cost tomorrow could survive. The new math kept one truth pinned to every map edge. Absence is a participant. Treat it like terrain. Pay for it like fuel. Count it like time. The arsenal that keeps the bill high. Stakes turned into strategy with a rule written in margins more than speeches. Make the other side pay more to stop you than you paid to show up. Not philosophy, procurement. On one ledger, platforms designed to live inside envelopes long enough to matter. On the other, defenses forced to buy deeper coverage, tighter clocks, smarter fusion, and more crews. The arithmetic rewarded a shallow cost curve and punished ambition that needed monuments. Action looked like an arsenal calibrated to send invoices. Bombers first. B-2s rolled from hangars like geography, black deltas swallowing runway lights. They didn't sprint. They arrived on schedule with heavy math. Their job was the opener writ large. Cross oceans, kill first eyes and nerves, leave before replies found footing. Each sortie erased a node and represented thousands of square kilometers. The defender suddenly had to instrument just to have a chance at a track. Then the bridge from miracle to mass. The ATF competition birthed the F-22, stealth that could maneuver and fuse sensors into one voice. It chose when to be seen and shaped fights so opponents paid to swing at shadows. Quantity followed with software. The F-35 wasn't just a jet. It was a node that made others better, finding, fusing, handing off. In a defender's ledger, that node multiplied the sensors required to deny a kill chain. In an attacker's ledger, a software update did work a new airframe used to. Weapons carried the same math. LISM learned to read a fleet like a neighborhood and choose doors that mattered. JASM stretched, standoff, until range rings felt like bad dreams. MALDs arrived as cheap questions that forced expensive answers. A thing that only looked like a weapon on a scope demanded emissions you couldn't ignore. Every radiating second wrote coordinates into someone else's plan. Arms cleaned up the stubborn, eyes that insisted on being loud paid in antennas. People forget jammers when they count costs. Stand-in jammers turned up inside defenses to buy minutes precisely when fusion wanted seconds. A pod wasn't glamorous. It was arithmetic. Spend X to deny Y minutes across Z sectors. The answer on the other side wasn't courage. It was peril. More ECCM modules, more integration tests, more crews rehearsing for patterns that refused to stay still. Impact accumulated, not exploded. Survivable shooters pushed defenders to grow sensors and fusers faster than they could harvest utility. Modularity kept the attacker's bill flat. Bomber racks didn't care whether they fed JDAMs or JASM. The cable harness didn't care which seeker got the message. A software drop upgraded brains without lifting a wrench. Hardware was skeleton. Code was muscle you could train overnight. A micro-story made the math tactile. Night over water, a B-2 opened a door and dropped 2 smart pieces of metal into a relay hub hardened in concrete and habit. The hub died. Hours later, F-35s that hadn't existed on big scopes arrived to finish whatever waved back. Their fused picture cued JASM launched by aircraft the defender could see but couldn't reach. MALDs filled the air with lies that behaved like truth. A stand-in jammer turned up in a narrow band a model didn't like and bought 4 minutes nobody would get back. On the other side of the line, a commander's map turned into an art project. Dots, gaps, arrows shaped by guesswork. He ordered more emissions, then more silence. Both cost. Human angles threaded the arithmetic. Planners stopped treating radars as obstacles and started treating them like subscriptions. They would build them until they turned off or died. Maintainers wiped knife edges because a sloppy seam was a budget leak. Pilots briefed yaw like cash. Downrange, Sam Cruz learned to shoot short bursts, fold, move, and spend risk instead of rubles they didn't control. Feedback closed the loop. Each defensive innovation, new waveforms, smarter fusers, mobile C2, earned respect and a rewrite. LISM got quieter. JASM bent around expectations. Jammers learned to deceive deceivers. Decoys learned to talk like weapons longer. The point wasn't permanent advantage, it was affordable repetition. One side could keep asking the same expensive question, the other had to keep paying to answer. Procurement followed the logic. Software spirals replaced block upgrades. Open architectures let one seeker talk to another without committees full of lawyers. The B-21 promised B-2 outcomes with B-52 sustainment habits. Fighters swapped pods like opinions. The math hardened into routine, pay once to enter, then spend modestly to stay. Across the border, new sensors, new missiles, better fusion pushed back. Ratios still bit. Low-frequency arrays and L-band noses made stealth sweat. Mobile SAMs complicated routes. But every layer added power, people, parts. The very things stealth had priced from the start. A planner summed it without poetry in a brief that never left his building. We don't need perfection to impose poverty. A handful of B-2 sorties, a drum of long-range munitions, a squadron of stealth fighters rotating through exercises with friends, and a kit bag of decoys and jammers kept a defender buying clocks, spares, and hours. The bill didn't arrive as disasters. It arrived as minutes, emissions you must make, fuel you must burn to move van cities, training you must stack to keep competence from becoming folklore. That was the arsenal's quiet genius. It didn't chase invulnerability. It priced the other side's certainty and sent the invoice by air. The AI, passive, and proliferation problem. Stakes shifted when seeing is expensive met compute is cheap. The same dynamic that priced a doctrine into collapse began to squeeze the advantage that created the bill. You didn't need one perfect radar anymore. You needed a crowd, imperfect ears and eyes, stitched by code into a picture good enough to act on. It started quietly in rooms that smelled like solder and coffee. Engineers fed machine, learning models rivers of clutter, rain, birds, ducting, wind farms, city echoes, and tagged the rare low observable returns hiding inside. The models learned to tease whispers from noise, not by physics alone, but by pattern across time and geography. A single VHF ping lied often. 1,000 correlated pings from 10 sites started telling the truth. The code didn't care about doctrine. It cared about statistics. Meanwhile, passive networks grew teeth. Receivers on hills, rooftops, ships listened to what stealth never promised to delete. Reflections off everything humans already broadcast. FM radio, TV towers, airport radars, 4G, 5G, satellite links. Every stray waveform became bait. A stealth jet sliding through an urban RF bath left a hole where a return should be. AI learned the hole's shape. Triangulation turned silence into a moving probability with confidence bands, where range rings used to sit. Low Earth orbit layered on top. Dozens, then hundreds of small satellites carried synthetic aperture radars and infrared eyes that mapped ground change and heat with revisit rates once reserved for superpowers. Models on the ground sifted their feeds for readiness signatures. SAM vans that shifted after 2 shots, emitters that woke in predictable cycles, fuel trucks carving patterns into dirt. You couldn't hide behavior. You could only make noticing it cost something. Compute made noticing cheap. The tactics bent fast. Low-frequency radars that once felt clumsy went digital. Cleaner receivers, smarter clutter rejection, better cooperation across sites. L-band noses rode on fighters to hand off cues no human could see. Passive receivers lined borders and harbors and cities. Fusion cells built from commercial gear turned regional snapshots into national pictures without bespoke hardware. The kit stopped looking like parades. It looked like racks. A micro scene from a coastal van caught the pivot. 3 probability blobs flickered into one when a decoy flew through a city's RF soup. The junior tech, eyes on a heat map, said, "That one breathes." They vectored their best asset and found nothing. Decoys sometimes breathe too. They laugh the way people do when black magic turns back into a normal problem with error rates. The next night, the model did better. Proliferation erased exclusivity. Countries that couldn't buy stealth bought bits of counter-stealth, commercial receivers, leased satellite feeds, off-the-shelf GPUs, contractors who taught fusing partials into decisions. Drone swarms arrived as poor man's decoys and sensors, saturating defenses with cheap questions and cameras that phoned home. A modest state could build a good enough net on a budget that used to buy a parade. The mystery of absence became a market. But integration still wrote the check, and the old lesson returned hard. Smart code doesn't replace logistics, it multiplies its importance. AI that promises fewer false alarms needs clean time and stable links. Passive nets require calibrated receivers and clocks that agree. LEO data demands storage and analysts who don't burn out. Cheaper compute lowered the barrier. It didn't erase it. You could assemble a clever picture for one sector. Scaling it across a border still cost in power, people, and patience. Attackers adjusted without speeches. Survivability shifted from platform purity to kill chain disruption. Stealth didn't retire, it got company. Deception layered with jamming. Cyber rode with standoff. Decoys arrived on the minute with real warheads from different horizons to drown classification in simultaneity. If the model learned your rhythm, you changed the song. Shuffle routes, bend timing, smear signatures across a city's noise so your absence looked like a bus line. A NATO exercise wrote the footnote. An adversary cell built from commercial gear fused passive RF, VHF, and a leased satellite feed to shadow a stealthy striker through a valley. Their probability track tightened. At the moment of truth, the striker changed altitude 1,000 feet because the weather model said the duct would break. The blob drifted into a deco. Everyone learned. The next day, the track held better, and the striker arrived anyway because a stand-in jammer bought 4 minutes in a narrow band the classifier disliked. The warning inside planning rooms sounded familiar and new. Don't repeat Moscow's mistake from a different angle. Chasing every sensor, every algorithm, would bankrupt the attacker the same way chasing every radar bankrupted the defender. Don't buy everything. Buy leverage. Use AI to spin routes faster than adversary fusion retrains. Treat proliferation as physics. Assume they see more tomorrow than today, and write plays that make their knowledge arrive 1 minute late. Human angles made the math human. A fusion chief taped a note over a rack. Clocks first. A pilot stopped talking about radar ranges and started talking about confidence bands. A maintainer on a satellite team wrote a checklist that counted analysts' shifts like spares. The language moved. Certainty turned into odds. Odds turned into time. Time turned into budget. Meaning didn't change, it sharpened. The original lesson came back wearing new clothes. Make the other side spend more to see you than you spent to show up, but price in software, satellites, and student coders. Stealth bought minutes. AI tries to shrink them. Your job is to stretch them again. By deception, by speed of planning, by allies who bring sensors you didn't pay for, by making every minute you steal cost them a day of retraining. The game's name stayed arithmetic. The invoice learned new font. The hidden ledger of victory. Stakes were never just radar plots and missile ranges. They were grocery lists, utility meters, and pay stubs. The Cold War's quiet winner wasn't a weapon, it was arithmetic. Stealth didn't defeat the Soviet Union, it priced its doctrine. The ledger reads clearer than any after-action report. Action looked like invoices stapled to necessities. VHF arrays meant copper that couldn't wire apartments. Over-the-horizon fences meant megawatts a city no longer had at dusk. Multistatic nets meant clocks that didn't show up for hospitals. Passive receivers sat on rooftops, while elevators downstairs stalled because the transformer upgrade slipped another quarter. Every clever countermeasure came with a receipt the economy had to sign. A micro-story reduced strategy to a kitchen. A mother boiled water in a dim flat while her husband marked night shift on a calendar that added up to more rubles and less meat. His plant had missed a shipment, clean wafers diverted to a defense lot. He shrugged and called it modernization. She pointed at the fridge and called it empty. Outside, a mast rose that would one day catch a whisper. Inside, a pantry didn't. On paper, the math was sterile. In 1989, Moscow published a bigger defense number, not truth, but larger. The Hoover Files show why. Publish a truer sum and risk credibility, or keep the old fiction and risk a treaty. They split the difference. The ledger didn't. Commanders heard more and wrote requisitions. Ministers heard more and cut elsewhere to keep the figure plausible. The result felt like a magic trick performed on rations. Meanwhile, the other side didn't sell miracles. It sold method. Stealth opened a door at a flat price, maintenance, planning, discipline, and let cheaper multipliers walk through. JDAM turned weather into a line item. MALD turned minutes into invoices. Harms turned stubborn emissions into scrap. JASM priced range until maps looked like opportunities instead of obstacles. A single night's work could send a year's budget into triage. The hidden ledger showed up in small, countable absences. A train schedule shifted to move radar modules. Coal stacked at the wrong depot for a week, and a power plant ran shy. A harvest controller shipped with capacitors that browned in frost. Yield targets slid, and the grocery line lengthened. A shop floor stamped within revised tolerance on a timing card. A fusion cell learned to trust its gut less and its excuses more. Each rational fix alone made sense. Together, they read like a bank statement you didn't open until the fees were bigger than the balance. The human angle stayed stubbornly specific. An engineer who could price an ADC's noise figure couldn't price a birthday cake. A colonel who knew sync down to microseconds didn't have spare time to see his daughter's recital. A chief who could teach conscripts to hear snow on a scope couldn't find solvent, so he used vodka. None of it looked like strategy. All of it was. Meaning arrived disguised as silence. Every minute a radar emitted was fuel burned, life consumed, spares spent, crews paid. Every new sensor added links, clocks, training, power. Integration, never free, became the commodity war was really fought over. The USSR had excelled at concentrating excellence, showpiece belts, flawless parades. Stealth forced dispersion of competence nationwide, quiet, unglamorous, expensive. Under oil slump and export controls, dispersion bled faster than pride could clot. A memo in a file drawer said the part nobody wanted to say at a podium: counter-stealth cost growth is unsustainable. The line wasn't defeatism, it was math. You could buy a network that sometimes caught a whisper, sometimes lied in storms, or you could buy bread. For a while, they tried to buy both and paid in promises. Across the border, the lesson hardened into doctrine. Don't chase invulnerability, chase leverage. Make the other side spend more to see you than you spent to show up. Keep your curve shallow, software over sculpture, updates over retooling, pods over monuments. Treat absence as time you rent by the minute, defend it with discipline. The rest is bookkeeping. That's the ledger the Cold War hid in plain sight. Not who had more jets, but who forced whom to write checks they couldn't cash on gear that almost worked. Not who fired the last shot, but who sent the bill first. Stealth didn't end a superpower. It charged one an hourly rate it couldn't afford. Detection turned conditional, and the side that priced minutes won quietly. If you want to see how that arithmetic drives today's standoff, decoys, and AI-assisted planning, watch our companion deep dive on the code that stretches time. Subscribe and line up the next story. The math didn't stop. It just learned new fonts.